Thank you all for being here. I start with a confession out of guilt, because, nothing like a South Asian with guilt. There's many of us around. But I am actually not Indian. I'm Sri Lankan. So I just want to be really upfront about it. But I am an immigrant. And I am South Asian. And I pass for Indian whenever I can. So there you go. But I am so incredibly honored and privileged to be sharing this space with you. And I wanted to see if you wanted to just say something to start off with, or can I just jump into my questions? Can I jump into my questions? Okay. So what we're going to do is have about 30 minutes of questions that I have. We might go off on a tangent, who knows? But we will have questions and answers for the last 10 minutes or so. So a question that I have is, having read work from both of you, and because of my own interests, I have a really kind of keen desire to know about how affect works in your work. So Suketu, in Immigrant Manifesto, you are unapologetically angry, sad, joyful, hopeful. In Brown Women Have Everything, that title is everything. Sayantani, you mentioned that humor was a central component for it. So my question is, when you decide to tell a story, your story, an immigrant story, stories of empires, past and present, what do you reach for emotionally? Do you sense emotion as a guide for how you write? Is it an accidental witness to the stories? How does it work? Where do you start in terms of emotion? Take this one. No.
This is working, right?
It is working.
Okay. So, first of all, thanks to the organizers for having me here. And when I was told that I was going to be on a panel with you, I sent you a very emotional email, because nearly 20 years ago, when I read Maximum City in preparation for coming to the US to study creative writing, yours was one of the books that completely blew my mind in terms of what was possible in writing.
Thank you.
That I get to share space with you is the most unbelievable honor of my life. So thank you so much.
I'm loving this panel.
I was going to say, what about me? I know, just
Same, exactly the same. Exactly the same.
I figured it was exactly the same, without exception, yeah.
So, to answer your question about affect and what I aim for in my writing, with this book, I felt a lot more freedom than I had felt with my first book of creative nonfiction, Fire Girl, essays on India, America, and the in-between. That book came out in 2016, and I had only recently graduated with my MFA in creative nonfiction. And I heard a lot of my professors' voices in my head as I was writing it. And I say this a lot in my own classes to my students, to try to not hear the professors' voices when they're writing. Because what it does is it takes away or minimizes or dilutes the story that you have to tell. And with this book, Brown Women Have Everything, I felt a lot more freedom and I felt a lot more confidence. And I think that was sort of the anchoring point. I was telling you earlier about how the title came about. Should I share?
Yes, please.
So soon after I got my current job, I was at a faculty staff event, and two older white women told me, of course you got this job. Black and brown women get all the jobs these days. They have everything. That sentence was so perplexing and so triggering in so many ways. But today, about 4 or 5 years since that instance, I'm so grateful for that phrase, because that has become the title of the book. And yes, brown women do indeed have everything. They have books, and they have stories to tell, and they have things to write, and so on and so forth. So, thank you. So I think giving yourself permission, which is not something and I use the word we here very loosely, we is for everyone. Giving permission to ourselves, feeling confidence in the stories we have to tell, I think that comes with knowing yourself a little bit more as you grow older. So I think that was probably the central question for me as I was writing this book. What do I know about myself now that I didn't know before? What I am more comfortable telling the world about myself that I wasn't, 5 years ago?
Yeah, first of all, thank you everyone for coming to this. It's great to be on this panel in my home state, North Carolina. I see many familiar faces in the audience. So, your questions about storytelling and emotions, and I think it's central to everything storytelling today, because there's a huge battle of storytelling going on around the planet today. Battle of storytelling about immigration, whether it's in Europe or Springfield, Ohio, or New York, or Pittsburgh, North Carolina. And there are these populists, like Trump, like Putin, like Modi, like Orban. And what is a populist? A populist is a gifted storyteller, someone who can tell a false story well. A narrative about migrants. They're coming here to rob and to rape and to take. How do you fight a populist? You can't fight him by false stories. You have, the only way you can tell and fight an entertainingly told false story is by telling a true story better. And this is where we storytellers come in. And that's why we storytellers, writers, journalists, filmmakers are being hounded around the world, bombed, assaulted, jailed, our taxes audited. So storytelling, this is why I'm a storyteller. And I'll tell you one story that really affected me. So when I was researching my book, This Land is Our Land, I went to a place called Friendship Park on the US-Mexico border. It's south of San Diego and just north of Tijuana. And Friendship Park was established under the Nixon administration as a place where if you were on the American side of the border and you had family on the other side, you could go and meet them. This is the only patch of land, it's right next to the sea, the only patch of land on the entire southern border where you could meet your family and, have a picnic with them, give them a hug, and then they would go back to Mexico, you'd go back to wherever you came from in the country. So with successive administrations, these barriers started coming up until when I went in 2018, under the Trump administration, there was a thick, ugly industrial mesh fence. But under the watchful eye of the Border Patrol, you could still go and meet your family for 15 minutes max, and only on weekends between 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. So I stood there for 2 weeks at Friendship Park and saw some of the most emotional scenes of my reporting career. These were families that had been separated, sometimes for years. And, there'd be the weekly Skype call, the phone call, and finally they were getting a chance to actually see their family face to face. And I remember standing there when there was a Mexican man who I met who was waiting to get in. And he had left Mexico 17 years earlier, and he was working in construction in Colorado. And he left, not because he hates Mexico, or his language, or his food, or his people. He left because his mom was sick, and he needed to work to pay her hospital bills. So he left 17 years ago, and of course, he didn't have papers, so he couldn't ever travel back to Mexico. His mom certainly couldn't come here. And he was talking to me, and he said, I'm going to see my mama after 17 years. And he goes there and there's this fence, and she's on the other side, and he puts his face up, and the holes in the fence are only small enough to put your pinky finger through. You can't touch each other. He goes up, mom puts her face up, he puts his face up, and she says, I miss you, my son. And he says, I just want to spend Christmas with you. And she says, you look too thin, you're not eating enough. That's what all moms say to them. And then, because he couldn't give her a hug, through the holes in the fence, he puts his pinky finger through, mom puts her pinky finger through, and they touch after 17 years. All along the fence, there were mothers and children, siblings, best friends, doing this elemental human thing, a touch of the slightest touch of the human body. If you've ever been sundered from a family member, separated from someone, if there's been any, go to this place and see what it means when the state separates you from your family. And so the narrative about migrants, like the man who, the construction worker, is that they have no family values. They've come here to rape and to rob and to kill. I mean, just about everyone who works in our house in Pittsburgh is an immigrant. The economy of the state and the country would collapse if it weren't for immigrants. But more than that, that story of, this man working heroically to keep his mom alive, that is the story we need to be telling about migrants.
Thank you, Suketu. I think one of the really powerful things also in the book, because you refer to that as a pinky kiss, that this was this touch of of intimacy, and then you also direct somebody else whose wife is in California, who's pregnant, and you tell him there's a hole in the fence that he can reach through and hold her hand. So there are these moments of incredible joy in the middle of that kind of tragedy that is unfolding and is still unfolding, right? Like this is, we are in unprecedented, we keep saying we're in unprecedented times, but we have been in unprecedented times. But I think we are feeling the urgency of everything that is collapsing now. And I think it's so powerful to hear stories from both of you about these experiences that are so grounded in our ability to recognize humanity, because I think what we have really lost is our ability to recognize each other as human. Sayantani, I was wondering whether in your own work, whether some of these themes have come up and how you have kind of addressed them, because I think now I'm going to turn into like a pop psychologist therapist and diagnose Suketu. But I was thinking, like, in your work, you can feel your politics are very clear. It's and unapologetic, and I think I'm wondering how that comes across in your own work, because I think because it takes a different approach to the immigrant experience, and adjacent certainly, but yeah.
Yeah, I think my understanding of immigrant experience was vastly shaped by my grandparents' experience. Both sides of my family had to go through the partition of 1947. So growing up, hearing the stories of everything that was lost just because powers that were decided far away from Chittagong district, which is where my paternal side is from, and Faridpur district, also in current Bangladesh, where my maternal side is from, that one day the news just arrived that you have to move to India. And what does it mean to move to India? What does India mean? And what does it mean to give up this land where both sides of my family had lived for generations? So in 2008, when I was a graduate student of creative writing, I got a grant to go to Bangladesh and actually see the land where our ancestral home used to stand. I have been an atheist since I was 15 years old, but being there was, and as cliche as it sounds, was the most sort of sacred experience of my life, sort of to know that without this, I wouldn't exist. Without even this tragedy of history, I wouldn't exist, because my parents met in Calcutta and got married there and so on and so forth. So when I came to North Carolina in 2018, within a month of my arrival here, Hurricane Florence showed up in Wilmington. And I had just moved from Idaho, which is northwest USA, does not have a history of hurricanes because it's inland northwest. And what does it mean? And I grew up in Delhi, so I don't have a sort of a sense of what a hurricane is. And initially my friends in North Carolina said, or my colleagues said, that, oh, hurricanes are not really scary, you might be out of power for one day. So I was like, okay, out of power for one day is not as horrifying. And then that clot over the Atlantic Ocean kept growing and growing, and it was like the eye of Sauron from Lord of the Rings, and it was so massive. And then it was going to be a Category 5 hurricane, which means that my apartment could lose its roof and trees could sail through and all of that. And still I didn't want to leave because all my savings had gone in moving from Idaho to North Carolina, and there was just, my husband was still in Idaho, but there was just no money for me to go back on. And then talking to my parents, when I called my parents because I had to figure out what to do, the moment I heard my dad's voice, I started crying. Because then I knew what it would do to him if I wasn't taking care of myself. So, but that move also happened not just because of the physical fear of what the hurricane was capable of, but because I have also heard so many stories of what it means to arrive in Calcutta without a roof over your head, or to stand in line for days on end waiting for food. My grandmothers were so against wasting even one grain of rice because they had lived through so much. So all of that is so tied together, and all the denial of climate change was also so much in my head when all of this was happening. So I think everything is political. Right? Everything, every decision we make is political. Everything we buy, where we buy from, how we react in situations, what books we buy, what we read, what television show we consume, everything is political. So I think everything I write, it's always there. And how do you not embrace that part of you? No?
I was also wondering, when this is such a broad question, but I've been thinking about this as I've read work from both of you. When did you realize that your own lives would become the blueprint for your writing? Which is I realize it's a very broad question.
At the age of 14, my parents brought me and my two younger sisters, one of whom's in the audience, Sejal, from Bombay to Jackson Heights in the borough of Queens, which is possibly the most diverse neighborhood in the country. But when we got there, it wasn't what it is now. I got put in an incredibly racist all-boys Catholic school in which I was the first minority. My sister got put in this public school where I think it was on her first day, she was holding an ice cream cone, and this girl came up and just knocked it out of her hand. I learned to run very fast in this Catholic school. The teachers called me a pagan. I mean, it was brutal. It was 3 years of just people who hated me for everything, how I looked, the color of my skin, my religion, you name it. The fact that I could write well in English, that really bothered them. And then it got better towards my senior year, because then I gathered a lunch table of the excluded. So this was, in my junior year, I remember someone coming down the hall saying, "Hey, Mehta, there's not a Hindu in school." And it turned out it wasn't a Hindu, it was a Jain, my friend Ashish, who's still one of my best friends. So it was me, the Hindu, he, the Jain, and there was a midget Irish angel dust addict named Tom Quinn. We called him the Mighty Quinn. There was a Cuban whose parents were part of the Watergate burglars. His dad was a plumber and sometime burglar.
I feel like I should be telling you to either sell this to Marvel Universe or unionize. One of the two things.
There was the school's only out gay student, a guy named Pisani, who was having an affair with the math teacher. There was an Indonesian who was obsessed with cars. So, I started writing in the English period just before lunch to entertain the lunch table of the excluded. And we were all hated. And so the way we got revenge was through humor. And we would make up just outrageous stories about the Brothers of the Sacred Heart, who were this gang of pedophiles that ran their school. And then, I went to NYU. I was supposed to enter the family diamond business. I'd never met a writer in my life. So then I had to take some sort of writing course, and I thought it was an easy A, and I started writing, and to my surprise, they liked my stories. And I think it was I think each life has like a central event, a fulcrum around which there's a before and an after. And when you look back on your life, it might be more than one, but there's generally one really big event. For some, it could be the death of a parent. For someone else, it could be when they were accepted to Yale. For me, it was that experience of moving, leaving behind everything I'd known at the age of 14 to come to this very new and very strange and threatening place. And so I realized I didn't want to spend my life selling shiny stones. And besides, I was a terrible diamond merchant. My father once brought home a packet of very small diamonds, and I spilled the diamonds on a shag carpet. So I had to spend the next 3 days taking them out. But I did find that storytelling was my way of taking revenge. And then someone told me about the Iowa Writers Workshop, and so I just applied on a whim, and I got in, to my astonishment. So I went from Jackson Heights, the most diverse neighborhood in the country, to Iowa City, Iowa, home of the world's biggest pig. And that might have been an even bigger culture shock than moving from Bombay to New York. So I write to explain these events, and particularly that central event, that fulcrum of time.
In my case, it came out of a homework assignment. I come from a family of poets and writers, but mostly writers of fiction. And when I got into my creative writing program, it was to study fiction. However, there was this requirement in my program that we had to take mandatory classes in poetry and creative nonfiction. So up to that point, I had been peddling bits of my life as fiction and writing about that. And then this particular creative nonfiction class with Professor Kim Barnes, the good Indian in me always wants to honor my teachers, so Kim Barnes. And the homework assignment was, we had to write about our conception, which meant we had to interview the people responsible for this conception. So I went to Kim and I said, I was still in my first year of joining the program, so I said to Kim, I'm from India, no one has ever had sex, least of my parents. So obviously I can't do this assignment. So Kim said, I will let you pull your foreigner card for a lot of things, but not this one, you have to do the homework. So this is 2006. I used Yahoo messenger to call my family, and I just read the assignment. My mother started laughing, good sign. My father started dying. Every second, he died a bit further. By the time I finished reading the assignment, he was completely gone. Then my mother gave lots of details. She was like,
She had been waiting for this
She
assignment.
had been waiting for this assignment. She said, oh, clearly your American professors are crazy, but I love them. We were in the Himalayas, and I'm dying myself, but also taking notes. And we could see the Kanchenjunga from our bedroom window, and all of these great sensory details that are so essential to writing anything. And then, the way you know your family, you know your parents' body language, so even if, you can't see it, you know it's happening. Then I heard my mother say this to my dad, and I know she elbowed him. So whatever 11% life was left in him just went out. And she said, you should say something, it's not like you weren't there. So my dad said 2 words and then he left the room. I think he's still somewhere in Delhi. I'm yet to find him, I think. He said, it rained. And he left. So the essay that came out of this horrific conversation, for some of us, for my mother, greatly amusing, this essay became the main essay of a chapbook I published in 2016 called The House of Nails. And I would never have thought of writing something like this if it weren't for the pressure of a homework. And now I'm a professor of creative nonfiction. So I think there is such great beauty, such great joy in forcing ourselves to do the things we don't want to do, because I changed my focus from fiction to creative nonfiction. And this thing that I got told in class over and over, that my voice was enough, my stories were enough, how I had experienced life in India, how I was experiencing life in Idaho. My then hometown, Moscow, Idaho, was a population of 23,000, slightly different from New Delhi, right? So lots to write about. The fact that this was enough was life-changing. So everything happened because of that homework.
It changed your mother's life too, I'm sure. Yeah, So I have one last question that I can ask before we open it up for Q&A from the audience. I was curious how living in the US South has affected your approach to your writing or the way you think about your stories, and specifically North Carolina, because I know it has had a profound impact, the geography has had a profound impact in my own thinking and writing. During the pandemic, we bought a house. We have 3.5 acres of land at the end of a dirt road. And it's completely isolated. And half of our neighbors are gun nuts, half are yoga teachers. I'm thinking of starting a new kind of yoga that will bring the gun nuts and the yoga teachers together. Yeah. Downward shooting dog, But we're the only non-white family on our road. And we were nervous, I must say, seeing all these Trump signs. And so my father passed away last year. And the entire neighborhood got together to sign a card and brought it over with a rose of Sharon plant, which we planted in the front yard in his memory. We spend half the year in Greenwich Village. We have a place on Bleecker Street, which is not like Pittsburgh, North Carolina. And then half the year we're here. And we have this incredible understanding of this whole other country that I never knew growing up. And that's some really interesting conversations
that happen. My parents would walk up and down this dirt road and just talk to anyone and everyone because they're just incredibly nosy. And my father
They're South
particularly...
Asian.
Yeah. Are you married?
Yeah.
And my father particularly just took an interest in anyone and everyone. So neighbors who had never spoken to each other, in fact, people didn't even know they were on the road, would speak to my parents as they went on their walks. And it's really expanded our understanding of this country. And what, we still have huge issues with the politics of some of our neighbors. But, we're all together, and when there's a storm, we need to depend on each other. There are values that we share, like a love of family. There are values that we don't share, like abortion and immigration and many, many other things. But it's possible to have conversations, especially if it's accompanied by good bourbon. And so I put out good bourbon on my back porch, and my neighbor across the street who flew 11 deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, he comes over at 6 and leaves at 2 in the morning because he wants to talk about what happened in the war, and I'm there listening. And we have, they like us. They particularly liked us after my aunt and uncle from Detroit came visiting. And so my uncle, Anil Masa, is this little Indian guy, balding, and they are, so my neighbors who custom make assault rifles, they love my aunt and uncle because my parents brought them over once, and the gun manufacturer was explaining to my Anil Masa, I said, this is America, we have the Second Amendment here, we believe in our guns, and he was showing like a whole armory. And my Anil Masa says, yes, I also like guns because I designed the artillery on the M1 Abrams tank. Holy shit, that's a much bigger gun than we have. There were all kinds of questions about tank cannons. And so we have street cred because of my Anil Masa.
So all we need is a tank too, yeah.
I think in my case, I'm still learning North Carolina. I'm still getting used to North Carolina. We came just a couple of years before the pandemic, so I think it impacted our understanding and how we felt in Wilmington, our current hometown. And I think in the last couple of years, it's begun to feel more like home because we have friends now. And of course, as everyone knows, the moment you have a community, you feel that much more settled. Wilmington itself is a very complicated city. There is very complicated history in Wilmington, so I find it important to talk about it in my classes. I find it important to write about it. There seems to be overall in the South a greater acknowledgement of things like ghost stories and folklore, and Bengalis are obsessed with ghost stories. I don't know if you know this, but we have whole classification of all kinds of ghosts. So there are ghosts who love fish, obviously. I mean, how can you be a self-respecting ghost in Bengal and not love fish? So, and there are also ghosts who live on specific trees, like banyan tree ghost is a different one from the one that lives on, say, a neem tree.
Those ghosts are in Sri Lanka too, I just wanted to know. Because we had one of the banyan ghosts in my backyard.
Maybe ours left too.
Yeah. He was a migrating ghost. I love that.
So I think there seems to be a little bit more acknowledgement of folklore and myths in the South, but I'm still exploring and understanding it myself. Yeah.
So this is more of a comment than a question, but I wanted to welcome both of you to North Carolina. I moved here when Mom and Dad moved here in 1972, and all of us in this room have some sort of immigrant story, and to finally see it in print and through all of your writings is just terrific, because these are all experiences that we have had but have never seen it on paper. And I just wanted to tell you, you've come to North Carolina at a very good time, because 50 years ago in school, I was always asked, are you black or are you white? And there was no other way. There was no other answer. I mean, life was very black and white, both literally and figuratively. And so I grew up here and went to college, went to medical school, and then I thought, oh, we've come such a long way. And then one of your neighbors, Suketu, from Pittsburgh, one of my patients, it was about the holidays, and he said, Doc, when are you going home? And I didn't even know where to start, because obviously home has been here for 50 years, and I know he meant, when are you going back to India? And so in the last 50 years, I just want to say that having a program like JLF being hosted by our hometown is just phenomenal, because to go from being having another answer than are you black or are you white, and another answer to, well, home is actually here, even though I look Indian, and I am Indian, but I'm also very complicated, have a Indian diaspora, as we all have experienced. So thank you for coming. Thank you for putting your words into print and coming to North.
Thank you.
Well, I just have a response to that. So at my sister and brother-in-law's wedding, Sejal and Jay, they got married in Pinehurst, where retired generals go to play golf. It was a wonderful wedding, and I was standing at one point next to Roy Cooper, who was then the Attorney General, and watching a whole bunch of white people, Indians, East Asians, blacks, Latinos, dressed in saris and kurtas, dancing to bluegrass. And I turned around and I said to Roy, this is not what I expected in North Carolina. It was 15 years ago. And he said, welcome to the New South.
We have a question. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you all so much for coming. I've read your work and I'm such a big fan, so thank you all so much. My question is that I've always wanted to be a writer since I was a little kid, and as I've grown older and started learning more about the publishing industry, I realized that publishing for anyone is incredibly tough, especially if you want to voice South Asian stories, especially in America where those aren't stories that are very well heard for. So as people that are so established in the industry, what advice would you have for young writers trying to publish?
It took me 12 years to get an agent and 88 rejections. So if you stop before that, I will not be happy with you. But perseverance, I think that's the key for any creative person, to make art, because you just kind of have to.
I completely agree. You write because you have to. And if you don't need to write, then don't. There's plenty of other things. You can go in the electrical appliance business, there's diamond business, and my parents were constantly urging me to find other things to do. But, there's actually quite a growing market for South Asian stories, because there's a lot of us in the country, and we read. Everywhere I go, there are just the fact that we have this global Jaipur Literary Festival. The mothership, Jaipur, I've attended there twice. It'll renew your faith in books. There's over 300,000 people who've assembled. 500,000, 500,000 people wanting to read books. Not all of them buy books, but there's all these school children that come up to you with, it's difficult when you're first establishing a career, and then it's more difficult after you establish a career, because then you have to keep writing, and there's so many other distractions. But people need stories, and I think the one advice I'd give you is learn how to tell a story, and then the medium doesn't matter. You can be a fiction writer, a journalist, a poet, you can write screenplays, you can write public relations brochures, storytelling matters. As I said earlier, the future of our planet hinges on storytelling. And the people who see storytelling as a moral calling, will, I think that's fundamental to ethical storytelling.
So, Mr. Mehta, I have a question for you. I like what you had to say about what do you do with a populist and then with false narratives. And I'm an eternal optimist, and I'd love to believe what you said, but I feel we're in a very difficult situation. We have these false narratives. Just tell the truth. Your story was beautiful. Specifically, look at any number of specific cases, Springfield, Ohio. These are things that are totally false, but it's still being bought. So I'm not sure your antidote will work, and I wanted you to reflect a little bit more on that. How do you combat evil stories? Truth doesn't seem to work. You have no choice but to use the truth, but what else can we do?
If we can, we'll just get one more question in, and then we'll go ahead.
I usually listen, not talk, but I've been here almost 60 years. So one of the early immigrants came directly to the Midwest in St. Louis for a higher study in medicine. Things are different in different parts of this country. This is why it's called United States of America. So please don't interpret one as a whole for the whole country. I have seen that everything from every section of the society being involved in medicine. And basically, most of the common people of the average are very generous, entertaining, and receiving. Biggest problem came from the snobby, rich professor type of people who looks at Indians still as a naked fakir. So in that context, and I have so many things to say, they'll fill up a book, possibly.
You should write.
Well, possibly I should, if I survive long enough. And I'm not a writer like you are all, particularly Suketu and others. So I must say to all, look at the country with that kind of a crystal ball, that it is United States of America. What is it's common in North is not common in Midwest, uncommon in the South. You just keep that in mind.
Thank you.
To your question about are the false narratives winning? Well, we'll find out on the first Tuesday in November. It's always been this way. Like, people talk about all these stories now are spreading because of social media. I've written a book about the history of immigration in this country, and the 19th century, it was, if anything, even worse. There was a whole political party called the Know Nothing Party, which was specifically formed in response to Irish and Catholic migration. 1/4 of Europe up and left for this country, and there was tremendous pushback. Throughout the 20th century, there was pushback. There were all kinds of horrifically anti-immigrant stories. But look, I think the good stories won out, because here we are celebrating Jaipur in North Carolina. Most of the people in this room are immigrants, and 2 out of 3 New Yorkers are immigrants or their children. And it's not just New York. I mentioned last night in my talk with Jhumpa, going to Chatham Square in Morrisville, and just the incredible range of cuisines from around the planet in that one little shopping center. There's the same thing in Pittsburgh, which is a town that is mostly white. But even in Pittsburgh, there are people who are coming in from around the planet. North Carolina right now is seeing a huge migration from other parts of the country. And there is pushback, but there's also recognition now, I think, in this country that we can't do without immigrants. So much of the debate now is about legal and illegal, right? It's like, oh, we're not against immigration, we're just against illegal immigration. Well, there was no legal or illegal immigration in the 19th century. Anyone who wanted to get on a boat could come to Ellis Island and just enter the country. The whole system of passports and visas is only an early 20th century invention. Until then, we've always traveled around the world and taken it as a birthright to travel around the world. So I argue for that strongly in my book. And it's quite an angry book. It begins in anger and ends in hope. And the anger is, I ask, why are people moving in the first place? We didn't move because we hated our country or language or food. We moved because colonialism, corporate colonialism, war, and climate change left us no choice. All these people coming through the Darien Gap right now, risking their families' lives, their own lives, they're doing it because they have no choice. Because the rich countries have stolen the future of the poor countries. And climate change is going to be the biggest driver of migration. And who caused it? We Americans are 4% of the global population. We put 1/3 of the excess carbon in the atmosphere, and the European countries another 1/4. And so when we drive big SUVs, the effect of this is a Guatemalan can't grow coffee. The crop is blighted. There's no possibility for them to make a living in Guatemala. They're beset by gangs, many of which have been armed by the US. So they pick up their little children and they risk life and limb to come here. And you know what? When they come here, we should be grateful because immigrants have a work ethic and family values like no one else. They have left, but they have energy and they want to make a new life in this country and send money back. They're not robbers and rapists, and so we should tell the truth and we should say it out loud and not be afraid of saying it. And this is why politics matters. This is why my brother-in-law, Jay Chowdhury, got into politics. The book ends in hope because I went around with Jay and saw as he knocked on doors, here's this guy who's in a 90% white district, and he becomes the first Bengali American state senator in North Carolina history. So my book ends with Jay's election because he told the true story better, and now he's sitting in the state senate.
I have so enjoyed spending this 45 minutes with you and with all of you, and I want to thank you both profoundly, not just for being here, but for the stories that you tell, and that the stories that you tell so well and with so much meaning, and for the changes that you are both making in the world. As a mother of a 15-year-old who I am always terrified for as the world unfolds, I'm incredibly heartened by the power of the words that you bring in and bring us all together. And thank you all for being here as well.